there's kind of I think, a misunderstanding of the fact that we have a God that is not just all loving, but he's also filled with justice. And, often we go to the loving part of God and we don't counterbalance it with, but wait, there's a God that's clearly a God of justice and who has some very clear direction in the Bible about how do you behave when you're mistreated.
Everything you do from then on is different.
One of the detectives, I think his name was
He was a
Derek.
golden boy.
All we can do right now is come together.
Extreme domestic violence, multiple rapes.
It's so good to have you on life support. And what we do here is we tell stories of redemption. We want you to develop a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. And our guest again during our time together will be Lynda Koehler, who is a marriage and family therapist. And Lynda, thank you for being here again.
Thank you for having me.
So
again.
great to have you. And when you were here last time, you told a story of your own life and how God led you through a process where you were abused within marriages and all kinds of abuse. It happened within a church setting.
Yeah.
You felt isolated, but at the end of the day, God led you through a process of redemption, and you met a man who is a real godly man, not the kind that you had met before that were pretend godly men.
That's absolutely true.
And so that led you into what you do now. You're a marriage and family therapist, and I can't think of a better person to be counseling people because you can identify with everything any client would say. But what has that been like to make that transition from someone who was experiencing that, from someone who was getting counsel, went through a really difficult process, and now here you are on the other end?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back a little ways for me. It started, I was very young, and I knew that I wanted to do this kind of work, and got thrown into a life where I chose a life really that I couldn't do it because I had to be a provider. A single mom, I was alone for so long, and so I was so grateful that God provided a way for me in the business world, and so I had risen to a pretty senior level in business, and just through that journey that I had been through in my life, one day said, I finished my degree in marriage and family counseling, and then subsequently got my license. And sat on it for a long time. Did my internship, the thousands of hours you have to do at the same time that I was working and traveling all over the world and doing everything that I was doing. But, at the point that I, married my husband, there were a couple of things that collided that I think God orchestrated. One was, from the abuse that I had suffered quite a bit of facial abuse, and I had a broken jaw, discovered that I had a broken jaw and a dislocated jaw. One morning I just couldn't open my mouth, and I was told that I needed to have a jaw joint replacement surgery done. I've had over 30 surgeries as a result of abuse, and have been very sick from lots of diseases that I've contracted from sexual addiction, from abuse, things like that. So after the surgery, I developed a nervous system disorder, very uncommon. I think I'm the 14th person in the world to have it.
Wow.
And so I'm in chronic pain, all the time, like intense chronic pain. And so that came together around the time, just shortly after I got married. And, I really felt led to leave the corporate world and start ministering to these women that were left behind, that I really felt like were left behind, and had been, because so many, even in my workplace where abuse was also prevalent, by the way, and I experienced quite a bit of abuse in corporate America. There are women everywhere that I had touched and seen, and they share their stories with each other, and I knew that it was a pervasive issue. I just didn't know how pervasive it was. So that transition, my husband was very supportive. So I just literally just one day said, I'm done. I'm leaving behind the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year that I make, and I am going to minister. I'm going to give back, and I really felt like God was calling me to do that. So I opened up my practice, and that was a significant transition, and then decided that I was going to specialize in the areas that I was most impacted, which are abuse and addiction, sexual addiction to be specific. And I exclusively work with women because, again, there's some really poor counsel out there, and not just from therapists, but from churches. And so, having started that transition, I one of the surprising things to me was how little pastors really are equipped to come alongside of women and even men, obviously families, of where this is actually going on. And so, we know that there are 3 out of 5 Christian women sitting in churches today that experience abuse at the hands of their husbands. And I'm not talking about just physical violence, or the obvious one is hitting. That's actually not the most common form of abuse. 2 out of 5 Christian men are being abused by their wives. And we're not doing a whole lot of talking about that in churches. And pastors don't really, aren't necessarily equipped about, what do I do with that? Like, what do I do with that? And I've experienced a lot of clients who came from my perspective, which is, well, you just got to make it better. You have to do things better. Be a better wife. Have better sex. Make better meals. Keep the house cleaner. Make sure it's clean when he gets home. And like we can control what he does, which we can't.
That's all Band-Aid mentality, though.
Yeah.
That doesn't get to the heart of the issue.
No, it does not get
No.
to the heart of the issue. And unfortunately, a lot of women take that advice. And so they try. And of course, that puts all the responsibility on them, none on their husbands. They feel like it's their fault. And so they stay and they get, very ingrained in that kind of a lifestyle. And their children witness it and see it and grow up in it. And
Why does the church so quickly, I'm just with a big C, why does the church so quickly just want to pass it off?
I just think it's icky. I mean, I think
It's
number
just
one
too
is
difficult and messy to deal with?
it's messy. It's hard. I mean, you really have to, you have to do what the Bible says. And that's, who likes to do that, especially in Minnesota, where we're very, this is a very Minnesota nice culture. So this would require confronting.
We're very nice here.
Yeah, we're not. We're actually.
For those that are
aggressively
listening in
nice.
other states, we're very nice in Minnesota.
We have pockets of that. Yes.
Yes.
We do. We have great people.
Yes.
But I think it's a hard topic to address. I think, there's some, there's kind of a misunderstanding of the fact that we have a God that is not just all loving, but he's also filled with justice. And, often we go to the loving part of God and we don't counterbalance it with, but wait, there's a God that's clearly a God of justice and who has some very clear direction in the Bible about how do you behave when you're mistreated. And, so, you kind of got to wonder if it's a question of, I've got to believe pastors know the Bible. So if we know the Bible, is it a courage question? I've heard pastors tell me, Lynda, I can't talk about that in this church. Well, why not? Well, because I won't get as many people in the pews. People don't want to listen to that. Okay, well, what about sexual addiction? We've got 70% of Christian men are addicted to porn.
So say that number again.
70%.
70%.
70%. 38% of pastors. 38% of
Wow.
pastors. 70% of Christian men. And
what forms does that addiction take?
yeah, that takes the form of the range. We're talking about pornography all the way through. And pornography, you start your sexual addiction at pornography because it's very covert and you do it by yourself. But like any addiction will escalate. This is why people overdose. And you can't overdose on sex. So what you do is you increase the risk of sex. So you move from something that you're doing by yourself to things that are in person with others. And ultimately, the ultimate risk is prostitution. So there's a spectrum of how people act out when
And
they're
that's
sexually
happening
addicted.
in churches right now,
Yeah,
right?
churches, pastors, you bet.
So how would you counsel a male pastor like me? One of the things that's difficult for me is when a woman comes forward and talks about this to me. I want to help. I know there are resources out there. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the boundaries. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the biggest issue.
Yeah.
I'm paranoid about those boundaries in a church.
Sure.
How would you counsel a male pastor that is approached by someone what does a pastor do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one, validate the person.
Mm-hmm.
Be present with them in their pain, and don't try and rationalize it, justify it. Say
Listen
he's
well.
the head of the house. You
Right.
need to submit to him. I mean,
Right.
that is the worst advice you can give somebody. But
Right.
so being present, listening, telling them that what's happening is not okay. It's just not okay. It's not biblical. I mean, it is a form of betrayal. It is sexual betrayal at its core when you know the Bible, right? So
for sure.
we're dealing with something very serious here that is beyond he just says that it's just, I'm just doing this and I'm doing it in the shower and it's no big deal. And hey, it could spice up our love life. Well, what does Jesus say about that? Is that consistent with the words of Jesus? No, it's not. So it needs to be addressed as such. And so, what ideally what would happen is, let's have a conversation. I'd like to meet with your husband, and I'd like you to get some counsel from someone who's really trained well in this, because our job as wives, our job as spouses, the ultimate calling we have is to turn our husbands back to the Lord. I mean, God is after the heart and soul of every husband and every wife and every person out there. That's his.
Yes.
That's why God is God.
For sure.
And so how do we do that? Do we do it by submitting? Do we do it by giving up ourselves, by believing our husbands when they're telling us lies about, this is your fault? If you just blank, then I wouldn't blank. No, we don't. We stand. And we say, no, that's not okay. This is not okay with me. And we set boundaries and we make it uncomfortable. And that models God's behavior. I mean, if you think about God in the Garden of Eden, perfect parent, perfect children, and his children sinned, and God didn't just say, well, that's okay. It's okay. And you're right. I got to be a better God. I mean,
well, I'm thinking of John 8, where there was a prostitute being stoned, and Jesus didn't condemn. Jesus came alongside of her.
Yep.
Jesus stopped I guess what could be called secondary abuse. And then he looked at her and said, but don't do this anymore.
Yeah, I forgive you, but
Right.
sin no more.
That's right.
And
That's right.
she came to Christ. But what happens when that doesn't happen with your husband? What happens when that doesn't happen with your wife? Then we go to consequences, right? We go to
Right.
boundaries and we say, things are going to have to move here a different way. And if they don't, you have a choice.
Right.
You can choose to get some help, because we have to treat sexual addiction as any other addiction, and how are addictions treated. First you have to withdraw. First you need to withdraw from the hits that you get in your brain that cause you and compel you to do this over and over again. People equate, in my field, the profession, when you look at sexual addiction, withdrawing from sexual addiction is like withdrawing from meth or heroin. It is that severe. That is the likeness that we're talking about. So you don't treat it lightly. You just don't say, I forgive you, it's all okay, and I believe that you won't ever do it again, because what you see is a pattern that emerges and evolves and continues behind your back. As I described earlier with my own experience, it just happened over and over and over. And so, it's the time where you say, okay, we tried we tried love, we tried patterning after love and forgiveness and mercy, and we always have those components. But the justice part needs to happen too. The consequences need to come as well. And so it's not something to take lightly.
I think part of the problem too, and maybe you would agree with this, Lynda, is that it would be easier for someone to step forward, say in a small group, and say, yeah, I'm a recovering alcoholic. Yeah, I did cocaine. To come forward and actually say, I'm either recovering from or have struggled with sexual addiction. It's a different connotation. People in the church look at it differently. It brings with it a whole different thing. And so no wonder people are isolated, because the moment you say those words, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, I think, it's just such a poignant truth that you mentioned, because sexual addiction by definition is not socially acceptable. And so when you look at that image and you get an image in your brain of what does that look like with a husband, what does that look like with a wife, what are they doing? People see pictures of that. They see what that looks like, and they say, ick. I mean, it's socially acceptable to drink and to take sleeping pills or to be on Xanax or what,
But like, go get a room is how people think about it.
Yeah, and it's kind of I think it's a way that the enemy keeps people stuck, is because it is such a sin of shame, and it's not out there in the light. It's a way that people tell themselves, I can't talk about it and I don't want to talk about it.
Well,
and
if you're a pastor, you're thinking, I have nowhere to go with this. Because you're thinking about, when I say you're, I'm not talking about
Yep.
me, I'm generally speaking, that there must be thoughts of, well, it's the only thing I can do for a living. My board is not going to work with me on this.
Right.
I love my family,
Yeah.
and the risk is huge because the pastor is supposed to be perfect,
Yes.
right? That's why you have a pastor. He's the one that stands up there and tells you how to live the
Above
Christian
reproach,
life.
right?
It's above reproach. And that brings us to the elder question. And that is, you mentioned, as you were telling your story, about these men who were elders in churches.
Yes.
Paul was very specific about
Yes.
elder qualifications.
Yes.
Sadly, many churches blow that off, take it lightly, don't even have elder training programs,
Yes.
etc. But even if you have all of that, these guys still slip through.
Yes.
So how do I as a pastor, how do I as a board member or a board chair that's listening, how do I identify someone who is living a lie?
Yeah, that's really tough. It's hard to do. But 100% of the time, the lie cannot be sustained over time. And so instead of looking at snapshots of people, you have to look at the pattern of their behavior, and you have to be looking for it. It slips through our churches all the time. And so, there are ways that you can kind of trust your intuition, and that you can wisely discern as well. Something's just not right.
So if
here.
something's nagging at you, don't just ignore it.
No,
But don't
trust your gut. We
trust
have
your gut,
we have a neural network,
and at
in
least
our
start to
gut
ask questions.
from the brain,
Right.
and at least
Right.
probe. What's
Right.
that about? I'm seeing something that's just not adding up here and not
Right.
making sense, because we can become the complicit culture that enables all of this to happen, and then it becomes a pervasive issue in our churches, right under our noses, and we don't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's a real problem in churches. And, for those of you that are still listening, thank you, because this is a hard topic, but it's so vitally important. And especially now in our culture when there are victims coming forward now, finally. There are denominations that are starting to deal with
Yes.
this. And I think that's really a positive step forward. But there's obviously a tremendous, still stigma around this issue. When you are counseling clients to try to come out of this and get their lives together, what do you tell them? What is the pathway to redemption?
The pathway is you've got to ground yourself in who Christ says you are, okay? And the promises of God about your identity, about who he created you to be, are the only solid foundation that you can stand on. Because by the time that they come to counsel, that's been taken from them, right? They've been told it's their fault, they're not enough, they're too fat, they're too whatever. That's why I'm doing
And they
these
believe it.
things. And they absolutely believe it.
Because
I
why
believed it.
why wouldn't they?
I believed it.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you believe that? You have no other explanation. And what's at stake for many of these people is if I do leave, what do I have? I don't have a house. I don't know where my kids are going to live. I have no income. I don't know what to do. I can't provide for myself. So I have no choice. And they do have a choice. So get grounded in what God says about who you are and who he is. We have a God who is a big God, who is very good at being God, and we have a hard time believing that about God when we're stuck in our circumstances. And so really getting kind of rewired on who are you listening to? Mm-hmm. What kind of tape are you playing in your brain? What's the laundry spin cycle that you're spinning around in there? Because if you're spinning on your own worthlessness, God's got some words for you about that. You are called. He has called you by name. He promises that he will redeem you. That we just have to ask, and we have to trust his provision. And that's a very hard thing to do.
So a woman that doesn't have permission from her husband to start down that road of redemption, maybe she's currently being abused. She's being controlled. She just can't go see a counselor, can't afford it.
Yeah.
What would you counsel that woman to begin to do?
Yeah, if you have resources through your church, who are, I want to say really trained well in this, ask questions. Do you have background? Do you have training in this? How do you handle these types of situations? There are many churches who will provide some benevolent funds to get that woman started. at least with some secure counsel, something that is biblically oriented. But also there's shelters. I mean, there are, if the abuse is that powerful and that strong, there's definitely a place to go if there's violence in the home.
So do something.
Do something. Because I think the question is, people say they're going to stay for the wrong reasons. I have to stay because I have kids. What am I, we have kids together. It's for the kids. I can do this until and it's like, what are you teaching your kids? What are you teaching your kids by allowing it to happen, by seeing what's being modeled in your home? So it's just a gentle start on that, and also lots of resources out there which we can put on our webpage about where do you go and what do you do. Too many that I can't count right now.
Sure,
but
sure.
First of all, get grounded in what the truth is. I think is the most important thing.
You also mentioned that men are being abused.
Yes.
What does that look like? Because we don't ever hear about that.
Well, women, with the fall came
curse.
Came the curse, and boy, we want to control our husbands, and there's lots of desires that we have around our husbands, and this tends to manifest much more as emotional abuse. And control, and shaming a husband, kind of not respecting your husband, but very overtly put downs, things of that nature. We do see women that punch, hit, slap, things of that nature, but most of it is it's emotional, like you're not enough and I'm in control, and it's meant to get control over the household and elevate oneself.
So when you see that man come forward that we all kind of joke about, well, who's the boss in that home?
Yeah.
And he's kind of meek. Well, maybe
that's a good
we
sign.
take a second look and go, I wonder
Yeah.
what's really going on in that home.
Yeah, what's happening there? What's happening with you? Or is everything okay? Are you what does that feel like? What's it like to, if I was a fly on the wall, what kinds of things do you hear every day from your wife? I mean, it's very hard, and we think this number is low because most men don't want to report it. There's so much shame that comes with, hey, identify me
that's
as
not
someone
something you
who's being
talk about on
abused by my
Saturday
wife.
morning with your guys at breakfast.
Very
It's,
hard.
so we have about a minute left. I just want people to know there's hope.
Yes, there is tremendous hope in Christ and healing. And there's been so much, countless, I can't tell you how many times women who start believing the truth about God's word for themselves and for their marriages are able to then gain some strength to do the courageous, hard things and start standing up to their husbands with some boundaries, with some limits that actually help their husbands turn back to the Lord. And that's, again, our ultimate call, is to get our husbands right with the Lord.
Yeah. Lynda, thanks so much. You've been a tremendous help, and your story is amazing. And thank you for giving us hope.
You're welcome.
Really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it a
me.
lot.